The journal Methode invited me to provide a commentary to the most recent journal issue. The chief editor, Marty Dominguez, asked me to elaborate on some aspects I had briefly mentioned in the editorial of the journal Public Understanding of Science, of which I am editor. And I made some remarks about the science communication community in that editorial and noticed that I have the impression that there is a strange schism between the theoretical discussion of science communication and the actual practice. I mean, the schism is that the theoretical discussion emphasizes public engagement. That means a kind of active and powerful position of citizens in the process of science communication based on the idea of democratization of science, of participation, of co-construction of lay people in knowledge production, and so on and so forth. On the practical side, persuasion, that means convincing people of some scientific knowledge or opinion or point of view, is one of the most frequent issues analyzed. And I mean, the assumption underlying a persuasion approach is that science is right and science communication serves the purpose of implanting, so to say, the truth in the head of the audience, which is very contrary to the idea of public engagement. Around the year 2000, there was a committee of the British House of Lords which propagated a new paradigm for science communication, moving beyond the traditional public understanding of science perspective. And this, they called it public engagement with science and technology. And this perspective or this paradigm was advocated by the science and technology studies community. While the public understanding of science, a traditional paradigm, focused on knowledge sharing, one-way top-down dissemination, and an educational approach, the public engagement with science and technology perspective considered the role of citizens to be more active and more powerful, not just as a kind of audience, but actively involved in the communication. And it asked for democratization of science. That has, I think, two main aspects. First, participation of citizens in decisions about science governance. So what should science do? What kind of perspective should they research, and so on and so forth. Another aspect of this public engagement approach is that it is very interested in the democratization of science. Democratization of science means first that the public or lay people are involved in decision-making on science governance. And it also means that lay people are involved in the construction of knowledge. They too are thought to have relevant expertise that they can contribute in this process. And these two perspectives lead to a different focus. If you think of science as an epistemic system, as in public understanding of science, then you are thinking of the relationship of scientists and citizens as a kind of gap. There is a gap between them in understanding, in knowledge, and so on. If you think about science as a social system, then the focus is on the interrelation. Scientists have impact on all kinds of social processes, and they can hurt social values, for example, or they can advance social values. Science is in the society, but the society is also in science. My opinion of these differences of views is that both views carry some truth. Public understanding of science is largely perceiving science communication as a kind of teaching and explanation. In my opinion, this is completely a very important task of science communication. However, this teaching relationship can take a pathological form. So it can develop into something like a student-master relationship. I mean, this is okay in school, but I mean, science communication is not making society to a school for science. The problem I see in the discussion we have about science communication models is that the deficit model is equated with this teaching and explanation mode of science communication. The idea of this deficit model is that scientists are superior to lay people because of their superior knowledge. And so this also encourages them to feel hierarchically superior to lay people, not just with respect to knowledge, but also with respect to all other kinds of orientations and beliefs. So this is a kind of background. And coming back to the schism that I mentioned in the beginning, the rhetoric in our community largely is that good science communication is science communication based on the public engagement paradigm. However, if we look at the practice, both in research and in communication, we have to acknowledge that one-way communication dominates. So practice is different from theory, and this is particularly visible if you look at these persuasion situations. And in these persuasion situations, the assumption is science is right, has the right knowledge, for example, about coronavirus vaccination. And the task of science communication, as I said before, is to put that idea in the heads of the audience. From my point of view, this is even more paternalistic than the traditional deficit model was. Persuasion approaches and persuasion research focuses on potential factors with impact on beliefs that have nothing to do with rational arguments or with knowledge, but refer to things like humor or so. I mean, this is not really rational. Yeah, okay. I come to some conclusions that I draw for myself, but think maybe an opportunity to think about certain developments in our community. First, I would say I'm not against the public engagement perspective or paradigm. I think it's a significant advancement to the limited epistemic perspective of public understanding of science. However, I think that the public engagement approach should be seen as an extension of public understanding of science, not as an alternative. There is some discussion of different models that include dissemination, for example. However, even in the discussion of different models, there is some kind of ranking implied. So the least valuable model is a dissemination one, and the most valuable model is a participatory communication one. And I don't think that is necessary to have this ranking. I think it depends on the situation. In some situations, dissemination is best. In some situations, participation is required. I think dissemination of knowledge remains essential. And we see this in the cases of COVID-19 and climate change crisis. There are several advantages of dissemination over dialogue. For example, it's time saving. It's scalable. I mean, how many scientists in a field like coronavirus do you have in a society? How many people do need information? So the scalability of a dialogical approach is problematic. Dialogue is valuable, but it has to be limited to certain groups. Either the groups of citizens are particularly interested in a topic or particularly affected from a topic, and so on. The next point I want to make is that some equate all of one-way dissemination with a deficit model approach. And I think this is absolutely absurd. There is a lot of dissemination which is not assuming a paternalistic relationship, which respects the autonomy of the audience and their right to make sense of the information offered. I've tried to develop a kind of concept that I call non-paternalistic knowledge communication. The general idea behind it is you should think of the relationship of scientist and layperson as a kind of consulting relationship. We go to a medical doctor, we go to a lawyer, and so on. I mean, going to a lawyer does not mean I have a deficit. We should think about the adequacy of the different models in different situations. And that also implies not only matters of what is effective, but also what is normatively appropriate. All kinds of persuasion, especially those that do not rely on arguments and knowledge, imply a kind of manipulation, if you want. And finally, the last point I want to make is that we should make transparent the normative and empirical presumptions of our own research or own communication practice.